So we're meeting today with Jim Posewitz, who's a conservation giant for us here in the state of Montana. And meeting at his office here in Helena, actually very close to where our MWA offices were for quite some time. Jim has his office here set up where he does a lot of his great conservation work, for instance, in present-day times for the Orion Institute, and we'll get into that a little bit more here as time goes on. So this is on January the 15th, 2014. So just a brief introductory, some comments about Jim. Jim, for many years, was working for the Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks for the state of Montana. The years, I believe, were 1961 through 1993. Hopefully I've got that about right.
Correct.
Has been the executive director of the Cinnabar Foundation. He is the executive director of the Orion Hunters Institute. I think that's still his present position.
No, that's passed, but I'm still on their board.
Still on the board, okay. And I think interesting, he's an adjunct professor of history and philosophy at Montana State University, which is a tie that goes back to Jim, who's basically a Wisconsinite, who came to Montana to play for the Bobcats. He got a football scholarship to play for Montana State University a few years ago. So one of his original tie-ins to come from the great Midwest, Aldo Leopold country, and come out here to the state of Montana. Speaking of that, one of the quotes that I'll start with, and I know Jim lives his life like this, and that's a quote that you learn back being a Bobcat. As long as there is time on the clock, you have to play the game.
That is correct.
That is correct. So Jim, just a few questions. Biographies are fascinating to a lot of people, myself included. Formative years, I think, are particularly fascinating. And just as one question to start off with, growing up in Wisconsin, I think Sheboygan or in the environs around there, any comments, thoughts you'd like to share with us about your influences and events that formed your conservation ethic and your passion that you did have and still have burning about the great outdoors?
Well, I think the first thing is there was something within it, myself as an individual, that was attracted to nature and the out of doors. When I was growing up in Wisconsin, I was born in the middle of the dirty 30s. Wisconsin had totally depleted its wildlife populations. Aldo Leopold had just barely begun addressing these things as a citizen and as a scientist. But one of the anecdotal stories I remember from that period of time, my dad ran a gas station. All of our focus in that community was towards athletics because there was no other source of entertainment in the 40s and late 30s. There were no deer in Sheboygan County, and Sheboygan is about an hour's drive from Packer Stadium, and it's halfway between Milwaukee and Green Bay. So you can tell how we were culturally oriented. I took to the Boy Scouts as a way of getting outdoors because no one in my family hunted or fished, they just worked. My dad ran a gas station, he sold Christmas trees during Christmas time to get a little extra money so we could have a few extras. And on one of those Christmas tree ventures, one of the men that went with him bought a deer from an Indian who had shot a deer. And he brought it home, tied it to the fender of his car, and drove all around town with it. But he gave me one of the legs, one of the feet of the deer, one of the hooves. And so when I was in Boy Scout camp, I was so addicted to it that I got to be a junior counselor, and I had this deer foot. And we would mark the woods with that foot to find the deer tracks when we were out on nature hikes with the Boy Scouts because there were no deer. And once a week we'd have a night hike, and one of the counselors would take the mounted deer head out of the mess hall, sit in the swamp with it, and we would take the night hike and shine the deer because we wanted to believe there was a deer in the forest. And my brother's sons now all grew up in that county, and they all hunted deer without leaving the county. And that marks the degree to which wildlife restoration occurred from basically the time of my birth, 1935. In 1936, Franklin Roosevelt calls the first North American Wildlife Conference. Aldo is there, and others. The National Wildlife Federation forms that same year. If you look out this window, you can see the Placer Hotel. That very same year, 1936 now, the Montana Wildlife Federation forms. And so it was out of this crucible of the economic depression, the drought, and the Dust Bowl that conservation of wildlife did not vanish, but was invented, nourished, created. And Ducks Unlimited forms in that time period. And so, the National Wilderness Society forms in the 30s. And so that, to me, was a very interesting, I guess, assembly of events that in our worst hard times, we devoted a significant part of our energy and attention as a society on the restoration of these wild amenities, these wild land values and these wildlife values. And if you look at it now, 70-some years later, we have an urban deer plan for the city of Helena. We have bears in our orchards, and we have goose poop on every golf shoe in the state. That is a remarkable cultural achievement. And it was done in a democracy. It wasn't some kind of a dictated event, but these cultural amenities such as hunting, which in most parts of the world had been reserved to people of property, privilege, and royalty, in America it attached to our democracy. And the root of that goes back to a court case in the New Jersey Meadowlands in 1842, where there was a dispute between a landowner and an oysterman. And the landowner didn't want the guy catching oysters out of the estuary of the Raritan River. I don't know if the current governor of New Jersey knows in this story.
Is there a bridge to it?
No bridge. But at any rate, the U.S. Supreme Court, looked at all our founding documents. Our Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, none of them mention fish and wildlife. Coming from European societies, many of the pioneers never gave much thought, because over in Europe, wildlife was owned by the property or the royalty, people of privilege or the people of property. To this day, that is true. But here the court said, because of the Declaration of Independence, that the people became the sovereign. And in that capacity, the rights and privileges that once attached to royalty attached to the people. And from that, we built this notion that wildlife in America was to be a public resource, belongs to everybody, shared by everybody. We went through some terrible carnage at the beginning of that, but the restoration of wildlife was based on that principle, that if you conserved, then you could share and you could engage in the pursuit or the chase or just the pure enjoyment of it. And so it was pretty remarkable cultural achievement if you look across the American landscape. A perfect example was Theodore Roosevelt. He shows up here in quest of one of the last bison, because he had this fantasy of getting in on the killing of a bison as a youth. He gets here in 1883. He's 24 years old, hunts for 9 days or something like that, finds a lone buffalo bull and shoots it, and does a war dance around the fallen buffalo. He was so excited. Writes home to his wife that he would bring home the fine head of a buffalo bull and some fine stags. Well, as his life unfolded, he comes back here to ranch and to hunt through the mid-1880s. He's in North Dakota, He talks to a ranchman who went looking for open range grazing land. And the ranchman makes a trip of 1,000 miles roughly from Medora, North Dakota, along the Milk River and back. So if you kind of imagine a 1,000-mile journey there, it would be from the North Dakota border to within sight of Glacier and back. And then T.R. writes, to use the ranchman's own words, I was never out of sight of a dead buffalo and never in sight of a live one. In a journey of 1,000 miles. We were the boneyard of the continent. And there are other writings and other authors that all fit that kind of a timeline, like Custer dies in 1876, nation celebrates its first centennial. We shipped 80,000 buffalo hides down the Missouri River from Fort Benton in that year. And and Theodore Roosevelt at that time would be a freshman at Harvard now. And those buffalo hide shipments out of Fort Benton in 8 years fall to zero, from 1876 to 1884. From 80,000 a year to zero. And granted, that's also the period when the railroads penetrated Montana, so many of the hides were going out by rail then. But nonetheless, they left that boneyard of a continent. When T.R. gets to be president, he has a conservation epiphany while living and hunting in Montana and living in North Dakota and hunting in Idaho, Wyoming. He shoots another buffalo in 1889, and he has a totally different reaction. In 83, he does a war dance in his excitement and glee. In 1889, he's very reflective, and he speaks of this doomed and vanishing race. Well, in 1887, he forms the Boone and Crockett Club for the introduction of the sporting code and the restoration of big game to North America. When he gets to be president, there's about 5,000 elk left living in Montana, in our wildest country. When the dirty 30s come and Franklin Roosevelt's president and he energizes the conservation movement, there's about 15,000 buffalo, elk, 3 times as many elk, so there's like 15,000 elk then. And today there's 10 times that many. So you can see kind of the historical flow of the restoration of wildlife to a continent and to a place, to a state, that would definitely had fit the definition as a boneyard of a resource. And it's now been restored. And I didn't know that when I was going to Boy Scout camp in Wisconsin. But that was a long time ago.
One of the participants for the Montana Wilderness Association History Project is the president of the Wild of Out chapter of the Montana Wilderness Association, Bill Hallinan. And Bill's here today, and I'm going to pass it over here to Bill now for questions that he's wanting to ask Jim.
Jim, in your career in conservation, you must have had many friends, many co-workers. And what qualities did you see in a person or a co-worker that you felt really made them stand out, or a leader in terms of conservation? I mean, you've been recognized, and I imagine it's for your work and for your speaking and your leadership abilities. But what do you look for in your career, and what would you look for in the future for good conservation-minded?
Well, probably the most dedicated conservationist that I met in this whole saga would be Phil and Robin Tawney. And Phil, of course, died way too young, but I mean, he was basically familiar and comfortable with being on the ground, in the field, in the forest or marsh or land, or whatever it was. And I guess I kind of got biased towards the people who had, for whatever reason, gone into hunting, because they became intimate with nature, and if they were able to not get distracted by, the addiction to the trophy size or how easy or how quick or how many things he killed. And a perfect example in Phil was one time he was hunting elk up Fish Creek, and he spotted 3 wolves crossing the high terrain. And it thrilled him beyond measure, beyond description, to have seen that. His mind didn't go to, there's a wolf, I gotta kill it. You know, and so it's these decisions people make, the values that they hold, and of course then you couple that, in Phil, couple that with his comfort in being engaged socially and culturally in the community. And so he had a foot in the wild, and then he had a pragmatic foot in reality, and an eagerness for the combat of it all.
When you say combat, what does that look like? I mean,
Well, the combat is an interesting thing, because when you look at it multi-generational, you see it will never go away in the human culture. I mean, we have people coming to Montana thinking they just found it. That they just found a Yellowstone River and it didn't have a dam on it, by golly. We got here just in time. Well, I'm glad they have that reaction to it. But we have to have an appreciation for the fact that the Yellowstone is dam free, because there were several generations now of people who stepped up at critical times to say, we value this thing as it is. It has values beyond simply generating power or slurrying coal or cooling off a power plant. It has value in just being a river. Same with the Wild Missouri section. You know, very few people realize that in the early 1960s, Corps of Engineers wanted to build 2 more dams. One at High Cow Creek, which would have flooded Loma and flooded right up to Fort Benton, and then a second dam above Fort Benton, because I guess they figured the people there wanted some pork too. But that was defeated by Montana people. And it's important, I think, that we know these stories, and that's why I'm glad you're capturing some of these stories, because you know, when you study Montana history, it's always the history of how we exploited the place. Mm-hmm. And when you talk to a Montana person and say, describe your state to me, they tell you what their values are. That conversation almost never starts with the Berkeley Pit. It always starts with the Bob Marshall, or the Yellowstone River, or the several forks of the undammed Flathead. All of those things have been fought over in our history. But we have to also realize that every time a new generation shows up, they have aspirations too, and they may see these wild places as resources that have, you know, that they can benefit from if we exploit them. Even though we're at a stage, I think, in our cultural evolution when we realize that that's a bargain with the devil. And so but that temptation is part of the human spirit, just like our desire to keep things wild and untrammeled. And so we have to keep doing this. This is a moving train. But we strengthen our resolve to continue this preservation, even though the pressure increases as our human population increases, I think, with the stories of those who have battled for them before, and, you know, or in their turn.
That's why this history project, I think I'm really excited about. A lot of people are, because we're going to document people like you who have fought for this with passion. And this will be a permanent record for the generation to follow, and that generation to follow that one, as far as people who are willing to be activists and fight for these wonderful lands.
Just one other question, in terms of getting people out, getting young people out. It seems like there's even in Helena here, where we're so close, you know, to these wild areas, it appears sometimes as if, you know, maybe the scouting troops aren't as strong as they used to in terms of getting many people out. Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts on that? You know, your children, grandchildren.
Well, I have some pictures. I guess it's the competition for a person's time. you know, and at some point, it seems like by the generation we accept certain goals or objectives or values or things like that, you know, and I think the Roaring '20s was a generation that could see nothing but exploitation as a purpose in being alive. And then we hit the hammer of the Great Economic Depression and the dirty '30s of the Dust Bowl and drought. And what generates from that is a new environmental ethic, which is strengthened in the '60s by the environmental movement and a lot of other social change that was going on in a generation that was focused on change. And so I think the notion of saving the planet now is going to have its own reality. It would be my expectation that that would set in motion a cultural evolution that would be significantly larger than the environmental movement of the early '70s, even because of the desperate state where we might be drifting towards here. So what we have to do is take these people who are electronically addicted now, or attracted, and wait for them to say, wait a minute, I'm not going to live my life controlled by this, electronic toy. And granted, it gives us a great enhanced capacity to communicate and to educate and to research and to learn. But I'm hoping that we come to the conclusion that that's only part of living. And I was impressed with when Theodore Roosevelt wrote his biography, and he discussed all the monumental changes that had occurred during his time, during his presidency. And then he wrote that these things were done for the economic well-being of